Hi, my name is John Forehand. I'm with the law firm of Kirk and Forehand Brandis, and I wanted to talk to you today just briefly about the bulletin that General Motors recently sent to all of its dealers in Florida. The GM Bulletin outlines General Motors policy with respect to mandatory disclosure of the sale of non-GM backed vehicle service contracts and non-GM parts and accessories. GM's policy is that each of its dealers must obtain a signed acknowledged disclosure form from any customer in the following circumstances. First, if a non-GM backed vehicle service contract is sold. Second, if a new GM vehicle is sold with non-GM parts or accessories. Third, if a non-GM part or accessory is used in the service of a GM vehicle. And fourth, if a used GM vehicle is sold with non-GM parts or non-GM accessories. GM provided a disclosure form that it wants its dealers to use and indicated that the form must be signed by the customer and kept in the deal jacket in each of the four circumstances discussed. The dealer service agreement, the sales and service agreement, indicates that in the first three instances, the sale of a non-GM vehicle service contract, the sale of a new GM vehicle with non-GM parts and accessories, or the sale of or the use of non-GM parts and accessories in the service of a GM vehicle. In each of those instances, a disclosure is required. However, the dealer sales and service agreement does not require a disclosure when selling a used GM. It does not require that a dealer use a disclosure drafted by General Motors, and it does not require that the dealer obtain the customer's signature on the disclosure that's provided. Many GM dealers are using the GM disclosure. Recently, General Motors sent a revised disclosure. That disclosure contains essentially two parts, the first part being for non-vehicle service contract sales, the second part being for non-GM parts and accessory sales. The disclosure is pretty good. However, there is one sentence in the non-GM part portion of the disclosure that is a little harsh. Basically, that sentence says that the part you're buying may damage your vehicle, it may compromise the safety features of the vehicle, and it may cause the warranty to be voided. Now, that may be true in certain limited circumstances, but generally speaking, that is not true, and it seems pretty harsh to include that in the disclosure. I know that there are dealers that are using the disclosure as written. They may be using their own disclosure, or they may even be using the GM disclosure, but with that sentence taken out. So I would say that the dealer sales and service agreement does require a disclosure in three instances, but not when selling a used vehicle. It does not require you to use the GM drafted disclosure, and it does not require having the disclosure signed by the customer, although that, of course, is always a good idea just to prove that the disclosure was given. Now, GM stated in its bulletin that there were 4 potential penalties that a dealer could face for failing to comply with all of the terms of the policy. The first is a $500 per vehicle penalty. There is no provision in Florida law that would permit a $500 penalty to a dealer. That essentially is a chargeback for a benefit that was never provided to the dealer. That penalty simply would not be permitted by Florida law. The second penalty is the inability to obtain future benefits, such as open points or additional points. Certainly, General Motors can control what dealers receive new points, but Florida law controls if a dealer's entitled to buy an existing point, and failure to comply with this policy is not going to be sufficient for General Motors to block a dealer from buying an existing GM point. The third penalty was loss of incentives, and in order to do that, General Motors would have to make the incentive specifically contingent on obtaining the disclosures in the form that they require. Contingent right now, the incentives provided to GM dealers are not contingent on these disclosures. So failure to comply with the disclosure policy is not going to result in a loss of the incentives. The incentives would have to be rewritten to provide that a dealer must specifically comply with the terms of the disclosure obligations in order to get the incentives. And then finally, the bulletin talks about termination. And there's simply almost no possibility that failure to comply with the disclosure obligation would result in termination. It certainly might be the case if it was an egregious and intentional fraudulent type of failure to disclose, but in most circumstances, Florida law requires a termination to be based on a substantial breach of a material provision of the sales and service agreement, and simply not getting the disclosures is probably not going to rise to that level. FADA has been dealing with this problem. They've drafted and sent a letter to General Motors requesting that General Motors withdraw the bulletins, go back to their previous policy where the simple disclosure was required on the three incidents that we discussed, and not requiring that the dealer use the GM specific disclosure. We'll keep you updated on what results from that effort. In the meantime, if you have questions, you can contact FADA and they'll either answer them or put you in touch with me and I'll answer them. Thanks.